All right, I'm going to talk about the world's happiest people and the lessons that they and big data can offer us to increase the odds that we'll be happier ourselves. But first, I thought we'd do a little exercise. Because we know that happiness is contagious, I thought it'd be fun to identify the happiest people at Zeitgeist 19. And in order to do that, I just need to ask you two questions. And your job, they're binary questions, either or questions. And your job is to raise your hand when the question pertains to you. Okay, just two questions. First question is about whether or not you think life is long or short. So raise your hand if you think life is short. Life is short. Now raise your hand if you think life is long. Okay? Second question is about whether or not you think life is hard or easy. Raise your hand if you think life is hard. Okay, less than half. Now raise your hand if you think life is easy. All right. I want everybody who thinks that life is long and easy to stand up. Long and easy, stand up. Go ahead, own it. I will not humiliate you too much. Okay. So a few years ago, stay standing if you would. A few years ago, Harvard did a research project, survey project on 3 different continents, and they asked those very same questions, and they correlated it to life satisfaction, civics, and generosity. And they found that the least happy people think that life is short and hard. In between are the people who think that life is long and hard and short and easy. But the happiest people, by a margin of about 40%, also the people about 50% more likely to vote and 60% more likely to give money, are the people who think that life is long and easy. The people standing up here. So if we could give them a round of applause. You want to invite those guys not only to your next cocktail party, but your next fundraiser. So, happiness. For National Geographic for the past 15 years or so, I have developed a bit of a specialty at finding extraordinary populations and then distilling the lessons the rest of us can learn. The first project was actually around longevity, and I tried to take a slightly different approach. Something called the Danish twin study established that only about 15% of how long the average person lives is dictated by genes. The other 80% or so is dictated by lifestyle. So I set off, in a sense, to reverse engineer longevity. I hired a team of demographers to find pockets around the world where people are living statistically longest. In Okinawa, Japan, you have the world's longest lived women, about 30 times more female centenarians than people over 60. Sardinia, Italy, longest lived men in the Nuoro province in the highlands. In Korea, Greece, you have a population of 10,000 people that also have the lowest rate of dementia. Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica, you have a population with the lowest rate of middle-age mortality, and they also have the longest telomeres for their age. Telomeres suggesting a biological age about 10 years less than the age on their birth certificates. And in Loma Linda, California, you have Americans who are living about 9 years longer than their North American counterparts. So then, once you've found these places, these are the people who've achieved the outcomes we want. I hired a second team of experts who could come in and tease out the correlations and the common denominators. And we found that no matter where you go in the world and you're seeing extraordinary longevity, first of all, they're eating mostly a plant-based diet, 90 to 100% lowly processed foods. 4 pillars of every longevity diet in the world are whole grains, greens, nuts, and beans. If you're eating about a cup of beans a day, you're probably adding 3 to 4 extra years of life to your life expectancy. They don't really exercise, at least in the way we think of exercise, but they move naturally. Every time they go to work or to a friend's house or out to eat, occasions a walk. They have gardens out back where they're constantly weeding or harvesting food. And they don't have all the mechanical conveniences that we do. There's not a button to push for housework and another button to push for yard work and another button to push for kitchen work. They're kneading that dough by hand or grinding that cord by hand. Our team calculates that they're nudged into movement every 20 minutes or so. So they're burning way more calories than they would if they're sitting in their office all day long and then show up at the gym for a half hour. Plus, they're keeping their metabolism at a higher rate all day long. They have vocabulary for purpose, ikigai in Okinawa, plan de vida in Costa Rica. So they have ballast for the difficult times. Their day-to-day decisions are easier. And this alone probably accounts for 6 extra years of life expectancy over people who are rudderless in life. They're surrounded by the right people. We now know that health behaviors are as contagious as catching a cold. If your 3 best friends are obese and unhealthy, there's a 150% better chance that you'll be overweight yourself. Drinking is contagious. Smoking is contagious. Drug use is contagious. In blue zones, people are surrounding themselves by people who reinforce the right behaviors and people who care about you on a bad day. And finally, they live in places where the healthy choice is the easy choice. They're not in food deserts. The cheapest and most accessible foods are fruits and vegetables. Most journeys can occasionally walk. So the key insight here actually is that in places where you have healthy aging, people are not pursuing health. It ensues. It ensues from the right environment. In places where people are living a long time, they're eating the right foods and they're moving naturally, not because of diets and exercise program, but it's because of the mutually supporting web of factors that help keep people do the right things for long enough and avoid the wrong things so that they're not developing obesity, diabetes, heart disease, certain types of cancers, and dementia. So I've actually, I speak a little bit, but my main job is I work for 28 American cities. I have a team of 200 people that take this very insight. Instead of trying to change people's behaviors, we change their environment to bring down the chronic disease rates. And I'm hired by insurance companies. And the reason this has some credibility is because we did a lot of work before we started out at rigorously measuring the populations that we derived our insights. And to really find a longevity hotspot, you have to go back 100 years and find a swath of births, say between 1915 and 1920, and you have to follow those people for a century. You adjust for immigration and emigration, and you count basically who survives. It's a straightforward mathematical equation. But what about happiness? How do you measure happiness? That's a spongier science. You can see somebody smiling today, but that might be masking depression. You can ask them about their happiness, and they might not know what you're talking about, or maybe they just had a few cocktails. So we had to look around for some, I would say, newer techniques for measuring happiness. And one of the techniques I relied on, I actually orchestrated a partnership between Gallup, the University of Pennsylvania, and Google. And between us, we examined more than 5 billion search inquiries, and we correlated them with life satisfaction. And we found out that what you look for on Google is a better predictor of your happiness than either your education or your income level, which is to say pretty powerful. Incidentally, we also discovered that people who are typing inquiries about their dogs are happier than people who own cats. People who are looking around for action and comedy movies are happier than people who like romances. So Jason and Natasha, I'm not sure you're still in the audience, but you're probably making people happier than you think. And for those of you who prefer movies in the privacy of your own room, people who are searching for softcore porn are happier than people who are looking for the harder stuff. And don't worry, this is anonymized data. We don't know who you are. But for the bulk of this research, I relied on a much bigger data set, literally tens of millions of surveys done over the past decade, a survey designed by a Nobel Prize winner, in part Daniel Kahneman, and administered by the Gallup organization. And what this does is it takes a universalized survey and applies it in 156 countries, representing 95% of the human population. And it asks a number of questions about happiness and the characteristics that might occasion that happiness. To be specific, it doesn't really ask about happiness because happiness itself is a meaningless term. You can't measure it, but social scientists can measure how satisfied you are with your life. They essentially ask you, on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you? And as it turns out, people are pretty accurate measurers of their own happiness. The problem is we only remember about 2% of our lives. We tend to remember the high points, when we had our first boyfriend or girlfriend, our low points, when we got dumped, and what happened most recently. If I asked you what you had for lunch a week ago Tuesday, you probably couldn't tell me. But if I asked you to recall how much worry and joy and how much you smiled in the last 24 hours, you could probably give me a pretty good answer. So the other dimension to these surveys has you do 24-hour recalls of something called positive affect, your daily emotions. And then there's a question about purpose, how often you use your strengths to do what you do best. That's the technical definition. And then a battery of about 75 other questions get at your demographics, your values, the characteristics of your life. And through the statistical magic of regression analysis, remember this is tens of millions of surveys, you can get a really clear snapshot of what seems to accompany happiness. And it's from this science we know, for example, that the worst years of our lives tend to be between ages 50 and 55. Those are the worst years. That's the bad news. The good news is after age 55, as long as you keep your health, happiness keeps going up. And by the time you're age 90, you're actually happier than you were when you were 20. This correlation work also tells us that in countries where women aren't treated equally, the women in that country are happier than the men. And in countries where there's gender equality, the men are happier than the women. So note to self, guys. So National Geographic, most of its articles are about science, but we do story-driven science and very visual. So the way we decided to tell this very data-driven story was to identify the happiest region of the happiest country in each of 3 continents. And we started with Asia. Does anyone want to take a guess what the happiest place in Asia is? Bhutan. Actually, they're number 91, but they have very good PR. Anybody else? Okinawa, longest lived. Actually, the happiest place, counterintuitively perhaps, is Singapore. 5 million people on the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. But if you pull away the curtain, you actually see some rationale why. Their economy has doubled 15 times since the mid-1960s. They're spotlessly clean, well-ordered. They have one of the highest life expectancies in the world as a nation, and they have one of the best hospital systems in the world. This country was carefully orchestrated by this man here, Lee Kuan Yew. Educated at Cambridge, not too far from here, speaks the Queen's English, but most importantly, he supremely understood Asian values. Asian values are a little bit different than the values in the West. In the West, we tend to value marching to our own drummer, self-actualization, but in Asia, it's more about how well you march with your colleagues, about order, about respecting authority, about harmony and security. And Lee Kuan Yew went about very methodically building a country that addressed those values. He inherited a country with 3 ethnicities, Indians, Malay Muslims, and the Chinese. And instead of letting one of those languages be dominant, he made English the lingua franca, which also turned out happened to be very good for finance. He made sure that everybody, or most people, get to own their own house. It has the highest home ownership rate in the world. But that each of these vertical cities reflected the ethnic diversity of the country. So there was no Malay ghetto and no Chinese gated community. Kids go to school together. They have more or less the same chance at a job. Probably the lowest rate of ethnic strife in the world. Very tough on crime. If you commit a violent crime, you rape somebody, you're going to get beat with a cane. If you possess more than 15 grams of an opioid, you're put to death, which sounds draconian, but I come from a country where 130 people a day die of an opioid crisis. Singapore has no opioid crisis. A woman can walk down a street any time of the day or night and not be afraid to be accosted, and kids can play out after midnight without having to, parents can let their kids basically run free. So when it comes to the trade-off, believe it or not, between freedom and security, most people will choose security, and Singapore is a very secure place. It's a type of happiness, this life satisfaction, that will appeal to people who like a nice, clear path to success. Keep your head down, work hard, and at the end of the road, you're guaranteed financial security, a life where your mother will be proud of you, your friends will be impressed, and you can have a lot of pride in what you have accomplished. And this sort of happiness, this life satisfaction, is mostly the happiness you see in your rearview mirror. On the other side of the planet, we found a place where they excel in a completely different kind of happiness. In Cartago, Costa Rica, you have an area here where people experience their day moment to moment, hour to hour, with the most positive emotions. And this is specifically in the Central Valley. It's a beautiful place. The temperature ranges between 20 and 25. They have some of the best coffee in the world. But the happiness is probably explained by the fact at the end of the last century, while the rest of Central America was ruled by puppet governments and military dictators, Costa Ricans voted teachers into office. The teachers put a priority on public health, making sure every kid was educated, making sure mothers were educated. So they had fewer children who were better educated, who grew up to be more productive, happier citizens themselves that made better voting decisions. And in the late 1940s, a president named Figueres was elected, and he did a couple very interesting things. First of all, he got rid of the military altogether, and he took all the money for the military budget, and he walked it over to the Ministry of Health, and he gave it to health. And that explains part of the fact that Costa Rica has the lowest rate of middle-age mortality in the world, apart from the fact that they are a blue zone. Costa Rica is a place where the top values are family, faith, and friends, and it's very rare you'll see somebody choosing work over a good party. So this is the type of happiness that will appeal to people who have kind of a carpe diem attitude. And then finally, I would say the happiest place in the world, Aarhus, Denmark. This is a place where the national poet pointed out that Denmark's a place where few have too much, and even fewer have too little. So you have the highest level of equality in the world. The ladder between the rich and poor is the shortest. It has the statistically highest level of tolerance, the highest level of trust. You can go into a cafe in Aarhus just about any morning where mothers gather to chat and have a cup of coffee, but because their toddlers make noise, they're kind of just left out in the lobby, and those crying little babies, well, they're just parked outside. Something you wouldn't see in New York City. This cliché that people in Denmark are happy because they have low expectations could not be further from the truth. Every single man, woman, and child in Denmark expects not only free health care, free education, free university tuition. When they go to university, they expect to be paid, and they expect to have a good retirement. And indeed, the happiest cohort in the world are people 65 and over in Denmark. So here you have a small place where ambition is not hugely celebrated, where pretty much everybody is taxed to the mean. So they're free to pursue jobs that suggest flow, art, architecture, furniture design, and the like. They sort of knock off after 37 hours a week, and they can pursue their passion no matter how bland or how bizarre. Or just take time off. I don't recommend this at home, by the way. So the lesson from Denmark is that when it comes to policy, you're probably better off creating a place where people don't have to worry about what happens when I get sick, how do I get my kids through school, what happens when I get old, as opposed to the relentless pursuit of more. So no matter where you go in the world and you see happy people, there's always a genesis. It's never by coincidence. In every place, you can trace it back to an enlightened group of leaders that shift the focus from economic development to quality of life. And they focus on policies that make sure every kid is educated, at least through high school, not necessarily PhDs or AI technicians. Make sure that the emphasis is not on treating sick people, but on keeping people healthy in the first place. Making sure mothers are educated. and that people are free to live out their values no matter what their faith or their lifestyle. The big one, though, is the notion that quality social services are not some result of some trickle-down economics, but rather they are considered a human right. So when it comes to happiness for nations, we're actually very clear. I know politicians don't often care much about evidence, but we know exactly what policies we should be implementing that makes it more likely populations will be happy. But for individuals, it's a little bit different. So for individuals, about 40% of how happy we are is dictated by our genes, even more than our longevity. About 15% is chance. Very hard to be happy if you're born with crushing pain or chronic depression, or your boss makes you advertise with Facebook. Just kidding, that last one. But about 50% is dictated by what the decisions you make in your life. And I argue that with these three different domains of happiness, life satisfaction, daily emotion, and purpose, we know pretty clearly which things favor each of these three. And by the way, they kind of come together like strands of a rope to create authentic and lasting happiness. When it comes to life satisfaction, you're better off getting an education, becoming financially secure. This type of happiness, billionaires report greater happiness than millionaires. But when it comes to day-to-day life, you're better off making about 50,000 euros a year and then stopping and focusing on making sure you're getting enough sleep, eating your vegetables, and getting some exercise. And then when it comes to purpose, it's knowing what you're good at, what you like to do, and making sure there's an outlet for those gifts, I call them, either in your work or through volunteering. Having kids, by the way, is always good for purpose, but in most countries, it makes you less happy on a day-to-day basis. It's a mixed bag. But a few things you can do, no matter what, will stack your deck in favor of happiness for all three of these. Number one is get the right job, not necessarily a job that pays a lot, but one that you love. Commit to a partner. People who've stayed married or committed for 10 years are about 3 times more likely to be happy than single people. Introverts are actually happier than they are with people than they are alone. But the happiest people are socializing face-to-face, as we're doing out in the halls out here, 6 hours a day, adopting a dog, easy way to do it. And the biggest thing, and if life and happiness were a cake recipe, the most important ingredients in that recipe are food, shelter, we all have to have our necessities covered, marrying the right person, having a good job, having some health care, having some mobility. But the ingredient with the biggest statistical variance, the most powerful ingredient in that recipe, is where you live. In other words, if you're unhappy, probably the best thing you can do is move. And we know that by following immigrants, 500,000 immigrants from unhappy places in the world as they move to Canada. And within 1 year, they don't change their age, their education level much, their sex, their sexual preference, their marital status. They don't change much of anything, but within 1 year, they start reporting the happiness level of their adoptive home. So most of us aren't going to be able to move, get up and move for our happiness, but here are a few things that you can do to stack the deck in favor of happiness, to shape your environment. I talk about a life radius with 6 different domains. The smallest domain is the domain right inside your head. I'm not a big believer in positive psychology because there's no evidence that gratitude journals or savoring last. But there is some good evidence that if you train your mind to meditate, it's a bit like riding a bicycle. It produces kind of a permanent muscle that allows you to enjoy the moment better. When it comes to finances, the effect of financial security is about 3 times more powerful than consumption. So for most people, if you have a little extra money left over at the end of the month, you're better off paying down your mortgage, buying insurance, or getting involved with one of these savings plans as opposed to buying a new pair of shoes or a gadget. When it comes to your home, you do well to have a front porch instead of a back deck. Front porch, you're more likely to get nudged into social interaction. Having at least one big window in your house that lets in good light and allows you to look out over nature. When it comes to your social network, this is very powerful. We know that every new happy person you invite to your immediate social networks increases your own chance of happiness by about 15%. The biggest determinant of whether or not you like your job is not how much you pay people, not how many compliments you give them. It is whether or not they have a best friend at work. This comes from 1.5 million surveys done in the United States over the last 10 years. So creating an environment where people can connect will stack the deck in favor. And the biggest indicators, the litmus test that you're living in a happy community are, number one, it's bikeable. Number two, you have walking access to a park. And number three, you have easy access to quality fruits and vegetables. That comes from Gallup data. So the takeaway here is that when it comes to happiness, don't try to change your behavior. Behavior occasionally works for the short run, but it will fail for almost all people, almost all the time in the long run. If you want to get happier, you're much better off focusing on optimizing your surroundings. And we now have a sea of big data to inform exactly what you can be doing to stack the deck in favor of not only a life you'll be proud of, but a life you will enjoy. Thank you.